reach out and it's somebody you can shake their hand and you're friends with them. That counts a lot, particularly when you're in a really tricky time. If you know that person who's on the end of the radio and you've got that hang on, then you can make things work.
Hey Space Watchers, and welcome to another episode of Space Café Radio. Today I'm here at the GEOINT 2026 in Aurora near Denver in the wonderful Colorado, and I'm sitting here together with Major General Paul Lynch. And General Lynch opened the main stage this morning with an uncomfortable argument. The alliance has a collection it needs. What it doesn't have is a pipeline to turn collection into decisions at speed. General, welcome to Space Café Radio. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And I'm delighted, finally, after the few years we've known each other, where I've managed to have a busy schedule where we haven't quite spoken. So it's delightful in my last few months to finally get to have an interview on this fantastic podcast.
Thank you very much. So maybe for our listeners, you can introduce the function that you're fulfilling at NATO, because everything I would say would be terribly wrong, and you know what you do, or at least what is in your contract.
I've been the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence in NATO Headquarters for nearly 3 years. And what I do with a brilliant team of actually almost all nations are represented in the unit that I look after. I have over 100 people who do, on one side, they do intelligence production to provide situational awareness for both the Secretary General, the North Atlantic Council and the Military Committee. They produce many hundreds of products every single year, and they are fantastic. And they come from both civilian and military intelligence services from across the 32 allies. And then I have a small unit that deal with strategy and policy. So what they try to do, and do really well at it, is get agreement from the allies to drive forward policy, to drive forward some of the strategy that my boss, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security, and there are 6 ASGs, as they're known as, in NATO Headquarters, as well as the Chair of the Military Committee and the Director General of the International Military Staff as the senior leadership level. And what we do is make sure that we can provide not just to the senior leaders, but also to the 60 plus committees and working groups in NATO Headquarters to make sure they've got the latest intelligence on which to make some good decisions, as well as coordinating with the Military Intelligence Committee and the Civilian Intelligence Committee, an understanding of what the alliance needs from intelligence, and then those agencies and services work together to produce what's called agreed intelligence. And that forms the absolute baseline for both operational planning and defence planning. And our role in it is to coordinate the strategic intelligence requirements and help them craft their production plan on an annual basis. So there's only a small amount to do. But to be honest, I couldn't work with a better team. They're fantastic.
That's great. Yeah, it's always a team that matters. And what I learned this morning, that you're just for 3 years appointed to NATO. What have you done before?
Before that, for the last roughly decade, I've been working in the UK MOD in defence intelligence. I'm a Royal Marine by background, so I also, in my past, commanded the Royal Marines' sort of eyes and ears of the Commando Brigade, or now the Commando Force as it is, in 30 Commando. And that gave me my sort of tick to then eventually, in the second stage of my Royal Marines career, to move into intelligence. But I've done a variety of operational roles in Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Iraq, and on amphibious deployments worldwide over what has now been, as of last month, a 30-year career.
Let's come back to your speech. You said when Allied intelligence sharing in the Ukraine fails, it's almost never a collection failure. It's an integration failure. And I listened very carefully, but what does that actually look like in practice?
If you remember back to those early days of the invasion, the Ukrainians very quickly realized that they had many people helping them by giving them data, giving them collect. But what they lacked at that stage was an ability to link that all together quickly to establish where Russian units were in order to then be able to strike them, let's be honest. By the time they'd fused that data, managed to get it to something that could affect them, the units had often moved. So they have set a really strong path, I think, for what is possible in a short period of time with the right motivation. And they introduced a variety of systems, one called Delta, which is a system where you can very quickly fuse alongside geospatial information, open source information, some electronic intelligence, data that come in from an ISR, intelligence surveillance reconnaissance collection, put onto one platform and then be able to really quickly link that platform to something that can shoot. It was then introduced, they were able to get some more advanced weaponry supplied by predominantly Western partners. Actually, then you had a system where not only did you know where these units were, you could do something about it.
Yeah.
And suddenly their effectiveness increased tenfold, probably even more than that. And that was the transformation. And that was before we moved into, as you'll see now, a huge proliferation of drone warfare and counter UAS, which has now moved into be a predominant part of the battlefield in Ukraine. So I think that was genuinely transformative. So if you can imagine where they were previously, not particularly modernized, didn't have the right amount of collection. But the key thing is once that collector was turned on, it then became an integration challenge. And they were able to actually relatively quickly turn that data into actionable intelligence that they could do something about. And that's where they started to turn the tide.
How long did the process take?
So my background, one of my previous roles before I came here, I was the commander of the National Centre for Geospatial Intelligence. And I won't get into too much details of what precisely was going on, but it took them months rather than years. And I think that's one of the challenges we face across the alliance. And I mentioned it in part in the speech that I delivered today to GEOINT. The real challenge is we rely on allies in order to produce their own capabilities. And that's entirely a sovereign decision. But of course, we have capability targets that we set to nations in order that we've got enough forces, the right sort of capabilities to have the regional plans. And I mentioned before about the deterrence and defence of the Euro-Atlantic region concept and a whole family of plans, and we call them the regional plans, where we're being really clear on what forces are required where with what capabilities. So learning lessons from Ukraine is filtering into that process to set particular targets for nations over the next, and it's a long period of time, but we're trying to get it at the front end. So they've got capabilities that are integratable into what ultimately the NATO system will be able to consume and help the Supreme Allied Commander Europe be able to fight the battle even more effectively than he can today.
Are we bringing back those learnings from the Ukraine into a national system? I asked the same question to the German militaries, but also on the NATO level. Are we there already?
The answer is yes, we are. And the formation last year of the Joint Analysis and Training Education Centre, which is the very first, so it's joint NATO and Ukraine together working under one roof in Poland. And it's designed purely to capture lessons. It's designed to capture those lessons, do the analysis, work out precisely what went well, what didn't go well, and then feed that back into NATO. And that means not just NATO headquarters and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the headquarters down in Mons still in Brussels, but actually out to allies as well. And as well as that, you've also got allies who are working with the Ukrainians very closely, who are learning the lessons directly from the battlefield as well, on their own sort of bilateral relationships. There'll be some multilateral relationships that sit outside of NATO. But for NATO itself, the formation of JATEC, where we're working hand in glove with the Ukrainians to say what learned, what went well, what should we learn, and making sure we don't learn any false lessons. So you need to have people there who really understand it. And I think that's what they've managed to achieve. The challenge, of course, always, so I'm not saying it's a panacea, it's not the only thing. So I mentioned those other parts of the forest where lessons are coming in. The real challenge is not just identifying lessons, it's learning lessons and turning those lessons into capability, turning those lessons into doctrine, turning those lessons into policy changes, turning those lessons into the things that make war happen more effectively. And in some areas, I think there's been huge success because we recognise it. In some areas, it's been identified and now the system is working out how best you can learn the lesson and build it back into capability. But the real challenge is, and it's a lesson from history, the next war you fight won't necessarily be like the war you're fighting now. And of course, NATO's not fighting. This is Ukraine fighting. We're learning lessons from somebody else's hard-won experience. But the real challenge is that Ukraine fighting Russia, we've seen how Russia has struggled, and it's struggling now from its initial sort of gains in a war that people thought might be over in 5 days is now on for 5 years. Their pace has slowed significantly. Their losses are, we can't even imagine the horrendous levels of human casualties the Russians are taking. But at the moment, they occupy around 20% of Ukraine. That's it. So that's the learning lessons from against a Russian military who are adapting, and they didn't adapt for some time, but who are adapting, particularly when it comes to drone and missile strikes. Of that, I think they have developed some capabilities they didn't have before the war. But the Ukrainians have got some amazing counter-US and counter-missile capabilities, in part supplied by the West, but actually domestic production for some of these capabilities that you've seen they're now starting to export to other nations, particularly in the Gulf as well, which I think is incredible turnaround. So they're really teaching people about certain aspects of modern warfare that very few nations have got that capability. But from a NATO perspective, what could the next war look like? And it may be different again. And what we need to do is make sure that we retain adaptability in the force structure that we have. But almost certainly drones and certain types of missiles more advanced will play a part. And we need to be able to ensure that we can defend against them.
That was the tactical level. Is the policy level also aligned to that as well? Because let's face it, Europe has great potential and lags behind its own capabilities because we can't agree on things. And that comes in on a political or on a policy level usually. But here we're talking about defending our home territory. And for me, as a Berliner, the front line is 1,000 kilometers away. It's 7 minutes by a ballistic rocket. It's real. It's not something what you read in the books or what happens in Afghanistan or somewhere in the world.
So I would say there are policies that are changing fast to account for some of those aspects you've just mentioned.
I'm not talking about the EU Space Act.
EU is a different organisation, which I love and I'm very proud of once belonging to. But at the moment, the focus is really on what does NATO do to better prepare? And there are certain policy areas that are being ripped up and rewritten entirely in order to ensure that SACEUR, General Guntovich, who's an amazing leader with a brilliant team, are able to be best prepared to fight these particular plans. First of all, it's deterrence. Deterrence has to have credibility across land, sea, air, cyber and space, all the domains at any time against any adversary. And what they've developed is plans that are, it's not a blast from the past. These are modernized plans to account for the type of warfare we would expect NATO to potentially encounter. The key is deterrence. And what you would have seen, or may have seen, there's been a number of what they call enhanced vigilance activities launched over the last few years. One relates to Eastern Sentry, which looks after the borders of the nations that we consider frontline to protect them better from air and missile defences in effect. You've then got another one called Baltic Sentry, which is in effect a deterrence operation against interference with critical underwater infrastructure. And then the latest one being Arctic Sentry, which again is one that is designed to best cohere the activity that allies are conducting in the Arctic as well as NATO activity into a more, I say, a coherent narrative and a coherent deterrence activity, which is really quite powerful. And we're learning by doing and working very closely with those nations in all those areas who have very specific expertise and relying on them in order to bring that expertise back into NATO to really maximise our deterrence effect. At the same time, as I mentioned previously, is making sure that we've got forces aligned to the plans. We understand where there may be gaps. We understand where there may be command and control issues and then rehearsing it. And that happens on a sort of an annual basis where they get to rehearse these plans and then refine them. Really understand where risk lies, really understand how to mitigate that risk. And I think, as I say, the team down at the Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE as it's known, down at Mons, have done what I think is just a remarkable job, working both alongside the fantastic team who work in the headquarters, but also some of the industrial partners to make sure that what they're able to deliver is genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. And the other part of it is then, and we go back to the politics of it, we're still in a 32-country-strong alliance, which is, and I say strong because I mean it that way, the strength comes from the alliance. Everything that we have comes from the alliance. It's a very small amount that's actually NATO owned and operated, but it comes from the alliance. And the real power of the alliance is consensus, is getting agreement on what it is that we need to do. And sometimes that can be challenging. As you said, there are different national perspectives on things. But actually, the way that intelligence helps this is form that baseline of what we think is happening in the world. And they agree on that. And then they use that for operational and defence planning. And because of that, they're able then to get to a point where actually they can agree. And consensus doesn't mean you agree with everything that's being said 100% necessarily, even though that would clearly be the highest level of consensus. But it means you agree with enough of what's being said and proposed that you won't hold up a red card or block it. And actually getting to that stage, it requires, and again, I have nothing but my fullest of admiration for both the people who work in the military committee and the ambassadors who work in the North Atlantic Council for how sophisticated their negotiation skills are, their diplomatic skills are to get to that stage. Because sometimes it can be quite challenging in the political world.
I can imagine. So let's come back to the GEOINT conversation that we started off. You called commercial GEOINT an integral part of the enterprise. And from the European and Asia-Pacific commercial side, what does meaningful contribution to the alliance actually look like?
So I think there's two parts to it. The first part is actually what allies and our numerous partners, how they're able to leverage the commercial space environment, space industry, how they're able to label that and then get end user license agreements where they're able to share the data, the products, the analytics into NATO. So we can either get end products or data. So that's the first part. And then the second part, probably two parts from a NATO perspective. There's the Allied Persistent Surveillance from Space Initiative. So we have, I think, 17, almost 18 allies who've signed up to this as an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding organisation. Not all allies yet, but that's the intent. Who have agreed to put both resource, that could be people or money, or data products and services that they have gotten from commercial industry to form, in effect, they call it a virtual constellation called Aquila. And the aim is that what we should be able to do, and it's reached its initial operating capability now, is take the requirements for either data or products to meet certain intelligence requirements, which are set by shape, put it into this virtual constellation. It's a task and ask type format. Gather in the provided data, products or analytics into an end-to-end pipeline where it then comes in. If it's necessary to go out to be federated, processed, exploited and disseminated, it will go that way. If it's a fully formed product, good to go, it can then go in effect straight through this system and then be aligned with the customer. Now, that's a step change from where we were 5 years ago, where it would be more like somebody would have something and just put it into the system. Just go in and then the system wasn't really set up for this end-to-end process. And we didn't have this pipeline to make sure that data analytics and products were most effectively delivered. Now that's happened.
The European Space Agency, ESA, last year called the program European Resilience from Space. So this systems of systems are, as they call it, we have our Iris Square on the European Union side. We have then the Earth observation governmental programs that might be coming up with the next MFF are also on the EU side. Then we have our national contributions to the military side, Germany with the 35 billion for SPOC, for the comms part, the ISR part. It's a full range of services. Other countries also going that way. Will it all find its way into one system?
I think that would be perhaps overambitious. That would be like the nirvana. When it comes to the EU and NATO, they're obviously different organisations. They have different policies, different sharing arrangements. And some of those policies are quite restrictive from sharing data information. There's some challenges that we face there. But actually, if there are allies who are part of the EU and part of NATO, actually, the joy about if they've written contracts carefully, particularly if they've gone out to commercial vendors that sit outside of their EU arrangements, they're able to therefore share that data, products and services with NATO. I don't think there'll be a universal system that is EU and NATO. That I don't think will happen. But what I can say is that there is a huge amount of work ongoing for both what we call digital transformation. I normally don't like the word transformation because just how do you get things better? How do you improve things? But I think it probably is a transformation in moving much of our digital architecture into sort of more like a cloud-based architecture, greater resilience. And that's a fairly long way down the particular path. And the policy that surrounds that is also pretty much done as well. So I think we're in a pretty good place on the NATO side for that to happen. Of course, as you mentioned, the nations themselves have got their own, whether it be for satellite comms, whether it be for how they launch things into space, recover, repair things. And actually, so is NATO. NATO taps into some of the good work that's being done. So there's a program called Northlink, which is about satellite communications in the RC. That there are a number of allies who've signed up to that to make greater efficiency in how you communicate in that particularly challenging environment. And then the same with Starlift is a number of allies who've clubbed together about how they can make better use of economies of scale in order to be able to launch, repair.
That's a rapid response.
Yeah, and again, we could get into how rapid response is because it is really challenging. We've visited a site in Norway, which is a launch site, and it is challenging. We need to rapid response. The listeners may think rapid response, press a button, and an hour later something goes up in the air. It's not that fast.
Firefly managed that within a month. The Invictus Nox project. I raised the same question with the German militaries when it comes to their programs. So that's interesting. You mentioned the NGA's Luno program as a right model. Is that applicable for Europe? And the other point to these different systems we just spoke about, interoperability, interfaces, standards. Are they working all on the same standards or are they all still tailor-made and hard to interoperable?
Interoperability is based on standards. And we have now, for the last few years, been really focused on standards. And there's a brilliant organization called the NATO Standardization Office, led by a fantastic French general, who's trying extraordinarily hard to make sure that each nation has an interoperability champion, which they do. We have a champion within the military committee. And so far, I think the intention has been led predominantly from the military perspective, is setting standards. But actually, we're trying to open that up a bit broader to the sort of the international staff or the civilian staff in NATO as well, to try and generate this, perhaps a slightly larger organization to focus on one of the most important things for interoperability, which is those data standards. And I think the challenge is that things move fast, new technologies move fast, and establishing within a nation is quite hard to establish a common baseline of standards. Establishing that across 32 is also hard and takes a bit of time, but there is a brilliant team who are working hard on it and the champions are working hard. On Luno, so this is NGA's Luno program, which is It's not just about AI, it's about speed, scale, and integration. It's trying to move GEOINT from being, as we understand it, analyst-fed reporting to this machine-driven insight using commercial data and automation to try and deliver near real-time intelligence. And certainly, as we mentioned before in Ukraine, that's the difference between seeing something and then acting on it with enough time for that action to be relevant. For NATO, I think the lesson is clear, and I mentioned it again today. It's not a technological challenge, although in part it is. It's a data and trust challenge. So a NATO version would probably need three things. And I think I mentioned some of these previously, but this whole idea of sharing by default, so sharing wider and automatically, sharing by default, you need a model of AI that does that at releasable levels, or we just won't have enough data in the system to make it worthwhile. Secondly, we need this commercial integration at scale. We need the providers in this brilliant conference, and there are too many to mention, so I won't, but many. You need those as in the core rather than peripheral. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the commercial space strategy signed recently is doing that, and I know they're working closely on an implementation plan to bring that to life. And thirdly, you need this sort of federated AI approach. You need it interoperable across nations and not necessarily centrally imposed, but just ensuring that, and we spoke about conflicting models earlier, you need it so that doesn't happen. It's interoperable by design. And if you can get that right, you move away from what we had previously, which would be static intelligence, to getting continuous insight. And that's where we talk about decision advantage. If you've got that, you start to get decision advantage.
On the technical side, standards are out there for years. I mean, the UK and Germany, I think, has great systems with DEAN and the UK equivalent on it. You mentioned earlier the AI challenge here as well. Your scenario this morning, to repeat it, 2 national AI models, 2 contradictory reports, 1 commander on the NATO side. Where in the alliance is this work actually happening? And what would it take to land an answer here?
At the moment, I don't think we'd be in a situation where that would happen the way I've described it. That's why it's hypothetical. I think at the moment, Sakure is working, his organisation is working very closely with Maven Smart Systems, being a decision engine. There are clearly many, but that's the one that we're currently working with. So as AI models go, that's the one that's providing that command with decision advantage. And I think for other nations, many are using similar systems, but not quite the same necessarily. But Sakure will only work off one version. So if you were to come up with, at the operational level, they will have this one system. I think that as nations invest more and develop some of their own capabilities that they're using, I think the key thing is that they will still need to be interoperable with NATO. We still need to make sure the idea of model governance, we need to understand what sits behind models that people are using. But if we can get the standards right, if we can understand how the models work and have standards that apply to those models as well, and understand what the assumptions are, and then get some sort of commonality, which NATO is able to do, so we can say this is what things need to be, not telling precisely, say, here's how you make it interoperable. And actually that scenario that I describe again as hypothetical, it shouldn't happen because we would have resolved this at the governance level. If we don't resolve it at the governance level, then that situation could exactly happen. And if I was a commander in that position, or in fact, if any nation was in that position with commanders facing that, where'd you go? Because then you're moving on to what human judgment and you're trying to move at machine speed. It will become more challenging, much more challenging.
Is there a risk that whoever moves first sets the standards here in that field as well?
So setting standards is, how would I phrase it? Let's go for international standards. And there are certain nations who are attempting to set standards that suit their style and their way of warfare. And you can see that happening. The challenge will be that if we want to be able to deter and then, if necessary, defend and win, we need to make sure those standards are ethically aligned with our values. If those aren't ethically aligned with our values, then they'll be aligned with somebody else's values. And those values may be very different. And they also may well be not as careful at ensuring that what they're targeting. So I think it's really important that like-minded nations who follow international humanitarian law, the respect of the rule of law in general, we should be setting those standards aligned with international conventions now. The real risk is that there are some nations who, as I say, have a different value system. And we need to make sure that what is set complies with international humanitarian law.
My next topic is around the relationships and what doesn't make headlines. And the line this morning that stayed with me was about February 2022. Sharing moved faster than the frameworks because people knew each other. How do you institutionalize that hard work?
A great question. You can institutionalize it by working together. So if we're a big alliance, there's 32 allies. We have a very demanding exercise program that not only is run down at SHAPE, but also within our headquarters, where people are constantly working in difficult environments against a hard scenario, the hardest scenario you could face. There's also elements where you'll take smaller exercises, maybe a tabletop type exercise, where you'll pick some really challenging scenarios and you put your flags down. And that means you're now not acting as though you're a nation. You're just acting as a bunch of people who are trying to learn and impart their wisdom to others. So how would you face this challenge? So there's a range of large force or formations physically moving in and around Eastern Europe or up in the high north on sort of deterrence exercise, but also on interoperability. So they're really challenging each other to work out, how do we do this? How do we do it better? And then on the other side, when you've got decision makers who are working together on really quite tricky areas to establish a common baseline of understanding around that area, which isn't always necessarily intuitive on how you would deal with it, and then learn from each other. So that's within NATO itself. But then now take that sort of even broader. You've then got bilateral relationships between allies. You've got our partnerships. As I say, where I came from within the National Centre for Geospatial Intelligence in the UK before I came to this job, we worked extraordinarily closely with a number of nations, particularly with the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Organisation, particularly with all of those. And we're working on a daily basis on sort of mission share. And you build up that level of trust by working together. And the great thing about the broader alliance, the 32 of us, is we're working together every day. We have a very clear-eyed conception of the adversaries that we face and the challenges, and working together every day to prepare ourselves, to constantly deter and then be ready to defend and fight and win.
On an industrial side, or in any given industry, especially also in the space sector, people stay there for years, for decades. So as you said, they know each other over time, they build trust, and that remains then. In a military environment, you have this concept of a rotation. You said you're in this post for 3 years. And I think that's a challenge. There's a meaning behind it. It's not just God-given. It's to learn more and to see different perspectives. It's all great. But gaining trust within this period of time and being then part of something bigger, how do you deal with that?
So I would say it depends. I think I'm quite unusual. I've been on NATO operations and worked alongside allies there and worked on many allies. But it's my first time of working in NATO in a force structure. And that's just speaking from my experience. There are many people in the UK who've worked in NATO environments and gone back into the system, and that experience is then perpetuated. I know from experience of working in Brussels, there are almost all the people I've worked with work at the director level within the international military staff, although I'm a deputy ASG or assistant secretary general. That's just the structure I'm in. My colleagues and friends that I work alongside at my level have spent most of their career in NATO environments, most of their career, so they all know each other. So I think actually, as nations are firmly putting NATO first and understanding the importance of that, the key thing now is putting people in NATO jobs back into a national job. So then over time, two things happen. One, your level of experience about how NATO works grows over time. But as importantly, your network of people in your particular environment, whether it be logistics, whether it be communication information systems, it could be amphibious warfare, whatever the thing is, you then develop a built-in sense of how the system works. And I do think, as importantly, you then know people, and it's about people. It really is. The fact being that if something is happening at pace and you ring up somebody you've established a relationship with, they know you, you know them, and you say, I'm going to ask you for quite a difficult favour. This is what I'm facing. Here's what I'm going to need from you. And as long as the politicians have established that before the pre-authorized activity, you can then integrate that really quickly into your plans. And it's about people. We talk about command relationship. You'd have heard people say TACCON, tactical control, or operational command, OPCON. There's something that informally people call hand-con. You reach out and it's somebody you can shake their hand and you're friends with them. That counts a lot, particularly when you're in a really tricky time. If you know that person who's on the end of the radio and you've got that hand-con, then you can make things work. If you follow the very strict rules of how you engage and how things are done, in war, that will be more challenging. You've got to be able to adapt fast.
Yeah.
And I think if people know each other, they trust each other, you'll fight better, you'll work together better, and you'll achieve more than you can achieve if you don't establish that relationship beforehand.
We are completely over time, but one last question I would love to discuss, because that was an interesting moment in your speech earlier that stuck with me. You said that's your last GEOINT in this role at the moment. And you said legacy is a comfortable illusion. And it took a while to work in my mind. So what is the one thing you hope your successor inherits and the one thing you wish you'd fixed?
For legacy, I think it is a comforting illusion. Often, that idea you leave and somehow you've made an indelible impression on an organization. I'm not saying people don't make a difference, because I fundamentally believe people do.
I found this question particularly interesting because I'm in an age where I'm asking myself, so what is the legacy you leave when you go? What are you leaving for your children? I thought from that point of view, and so it hit me from the wrong side, I would say.
So I think we can follow the logic through. It's exactly the same logic. The same logic is, again, there's a few answers. One, it's not about you. So in an organization, we come back to family in a minute, but for an organizational perspective, it's not about you. I've seen people describe it this. Imagine a bucket of water. You put your hand in, you take it out. That's what you've left. Because the organization moves on. I think if you've got structure, process, and incentive built for continuity, you actually, especially in a large bureaucracy, the idea that things are fundamentally changed. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying that it's not often it happens. That's all. So my thing, I think I've put some momentum behind some key initiatives. I think I've done some quite quiet, hard work to improve outcomes, strengthening teams, fixing decision quality, building trust across sites. And I think that matters more than these sort of headline-grabbing changes that you see some. I see it in my environment, but some leaders will go for these sort of shiny things, which may not deliver over time. So I think I've left the system, I hope, a bit clearer, a bit faster. And I hesitate to say there's people more capable than 3 years ago, because I don't mean that they weren't capable then. I just think they've gotten better over time. And that was the thing I said, the thing I'm most, and I don't like to say I'm most proud of. I'm most proud of to have served with a fantastic team who've delivered intelligence to NATO Headquarters, and a fantastic team who worked really hard to improve NATO's intelligence enterprise, which I think is true. For my successor, and she'll do a brilliant job. I know she's really, really keen to get involved and be in this role, and she's going to have a fantastic time and a challenging time, because as my predecessor said to me beforehand, that this job was the best intelligence job in NATO. And it's true. I've lived this, and there's going to be some challenges, but I think it's fantastic. I say, what do I think that I'll leave? I will leave nothing. When I go, there'll be a brilliant team in place. And I liken it when I speak to the team and say, they're in the river. You imagine a raging river. They're in the river and they're swimming and they're doing stuff and they're working together. Anybody new comes along, initially, they just put their toes in the water and they see people, this doesn't seem too bad here. But over time, the team, you get drawn in. Or you can liken it to another way where, well, I've done this when I've left jobs previously, is in effect, the metaphor is I'm carrying a big heavy rucksack. As a leader, you just carry this and it's full of lots of stones and rocks that people have given you, things you've put in the bag. But as you get towards the end of your time, you end up taking stones out and putting them in other people's rucksacks to make this rucksack you're going to hand over to your successor a bit lighter. So when they put it on at first, they go, it's not too bad. And then over time, they build up that capacity where people start to put the rocks back in, and then you can carry that heavy load. The point about legacy, and again, your point about family being a comforting illusion, often legacy. But I go back to the point of it's that quiet, hard work that you've done as a parent. That matters more than I got my son and daughter into somewhere. It's not that. It's about character. There's a brilliant quote that I've had at the top of my notebook of things I'd wish I'd written. It's Abraham Lincoln, where character is like a tree and reputation its shadow. People think about reputation, but it's character that matters. Character is everything. And I think if you can, at the end of your time as a parent, have children that have a good character, a good work ethic, then to be honest, they're well set in life.
Paul, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute fantastic conversation. And I would say I wish we had it earlier, but I think that's the right moment in time. And I wish you all the best for your future and obviously for the organization you will leave, but you will leave them in good hands.
Exactly that. Thank you, Torsten. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And SpaceWatch out. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.